Hi, it's Richard White here again. Today's fly is one inspired by the Carrie Stevens style streamers. I call this one Munsungan Gold. The whole idea here was to try to imitate with feathers and fur the colors of the copper colored spoons that are very, very effective for landlocked salmon up in northern Maine. And I've never seen any copper colored feathers, so my goal here was to try to get a similar effect using feathers I did have. And it's still a pretty straightforward fly. Let me demonstrate. So I'm starting with a fairly standard thread. This is a rust brown in a 6/0, 136 denier. And you know, as with any fly, I'm going to start a little bit behind the eye. Clip off the excess, and then the body is going to be built up from copper colored Mylar. This particular one is copper on one side and blue on the other, number 10. So I will take off an appropriate section. Clip it off. And when I tie it on, I'm going to tie it on with the blue side facing me, so that when I start to wind it, the copper side will show. So I'm going to pin that to the side of the shank, and in fairly close turns, but they don't have to be touching. I'm just going to bind that as I go down the shank. And I'm going to go all the way down the long shank. This is a Mustad R79 hook. It's a 9 extra long. They're great hooks, but unfortunately Mustad does not make them anymore. Once I've reached the rear, bind it down a little more firmly there, then I'm going to come most of the way back forward. With a longer hook, sometimes it's helpful to hold it with your fingers as you come forward. And I'm going to come forward back to where I started winding up, laying on the Mylar. Now I can wrap, and you notice the copper side is the side that will come forward, be visible. I generally prefer to wrap by hand, but of course with a rotary vise you could be using the vise to do the rotation instead. I just like the control I get by hand, and it's just what I'm used to doing. I use the rotary vise more for help me see the positioning of particular materials than I do to actually help me wind anything on. So I bring the Mylar all the way forward, a few turns to wrap it down. In this case, since the thread is down, I can lift up to clip. That way no danger of clipping my thread. That little tag end is then easily tied down. So now I'm going to start working on the underside of the fly. So I'll invert it just so it's simpler. Now not only will I invert it, I'm going to tilt it slightly toward myself so that the hook point is in line with the shank from my point of view. That way I can see that anything I put on is going exactly on the underside of the hook. First layer here is a golden cream colored bucktail. This is from a company called Musky Fool. They have a lot of interesting colors, a very high grade bucktail. It's very fine and soft, so it moves very well in the water. Excuse me while I cut a little off here. Don't want very much. It's just to give a hint of color on the underside of the fly. So I pluck some off. I pull out any shorter fibers. I don't mind that they're not completely uniform at the ends. And I'll lay this in so it goes just about back to the bend of the hook. I prefer to cut the ends off before tying it in. I just find it's easier to cut that way. Now, since I'm looking exactly at the underside of the hook, I can easily lay these fibers on the underside and bind them down. Now, since it's a fairly soft bucktail, it does not flare a lot, so I can get it to sit very much along the hook shank. Next, I need something white. You could use white bucktail. I prefer using goat hair. It's softer, it moves a little more, and it does not flare, which is nice because it it allows you to control the shape of the fly much more effectively than if you were to use bucktail here. So as with the bucktail, I'm going to get it to the length I want by measuring along the hook shank. Clip off any excess. Then lay this on the underside of the fly, tying it in almost exactly on top of, a little bit in front of where I tied down the previous bucktail. Neaten that up a little bit, and that'll keep the body fairly smooth. And if I want, I can always come back and do a few softer turns, and then towards the rear, and then tighter turns towards the front, and that will help keep the underside of the fly nice and slim. Okay, now under that I want just a little bit of red for the throat, just to give a hint of red. I'm just going to use a little bit of red hackle fiber. I'll pluck some of those off. I'm not using very many. Again, I'll turn so I can see the underside of the fly effectively. Just going to trim that so they're even, so it's easier to tie in. Bring my thread back, so when I'm wrapping over this, I'm wrapping forward, and then I can lay just a little bit of red on the underside, give a little red throat, sort of do the gills. So now it's time to move to the wings. For the wings, I'm going to use orange bucktail to give the closest thing I have to a copper color. And then I'm going to tie in, so orange bucktail, orange saddle hackle, and then outside of that I'm going to use sort of a golden badger, and that softens the look of the orange a little bit to get it a little closer to copper colored. I would love to be able to find an actual copper colored hackle feather, but I have yet to find anything even close. So now I'm going to find a few hackles that are fairly long. Those are probably a little longer than I like, but the trick is often finding hackles that give you the shape you want and the length you want that aren't damaged. And here I'm going to want slightly thicker ones. So I'm going to go through and try to find a few that are as similar as possible to pluck off. So here I have two that are fairly similar. Let me pull those out. Now, many people would prepare feathers in advance, gluing feathers or lashing feathers together, so that you're only putting feathers on the hook shank once on each side. I'm still more comfortable laying them in one at a time. Now, one of the things I almost always do is, well, first you always figure out how long the feather is going to be, how far beyond the bend of the hook you want to go, and since it's landlocked salmon, I don't want to go too far back. They do tend to come down on the rear of the fly most of the time. So I can see where I'm going to tie it in. I'm going to use a pair of flat nose pliers to flatten those stems. That makes it much, much easier to tie them in. Then I can strip off extra hackle, extra length there, trim it to length. Again, I'm going to turn the hook so that I'm looking exactly at the side of the fly. That way I can lay the feather exactly where I want it on the side, a few times over it to make sure it sits flat. And so I'm sure it's sitting flat, then I can clean it up a little bit and go over it a few more times. Then I can rotate to see the other side. And then I'll repeat the process on the other side, obviously with the shiny sides out. So I lay my feather in, I figure the length, strip off the excess fibers, use the pliers to flatten, and sometimes that's very important because some of these have the axis can become more lateral on some of them, making it harder to lash them in without them rotating. So now I lay this on exactly where I want it, again with the side facing me that I want to tie it to. Come down, whoops, don't want that catching in there. So a few times over that to make sure it's sitting flat the way I want it to. And since I'm happy with that, a few more turns, come back a few more towards the front so it stays straight since I'm binding it over a greater length. Clip that off. Alright, so now I'm going to repeat that process with the golden badger hackle outside of that. So first I'm going to pick a few hackles off of here, and I don't mind if these are a little bit shorter than the orange wing hackle. But I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to lay these on top of the orange. So measure my length by measuring against the fly. Once I have measured it, strip off the excess. Again, flatten the stem, that way they tie in more effectively. Then I can lay that right on top of the orange hackle, bind it in, make sure I like the way it's sitting, and if I do, it sits nicely. Repeat for the other side, measure, strip, flatten, tie in, and adjust as you go to make sure you like the way it's sitting. Once you're happy that it's sitting exactly the way you want, I'll clean this up a little bit. Now I can go in and snip off the stems. Clean up a little more. Now the trick is to put on the cheek pieces. And for the cheeks, I'm using pheasant rump that's been dyed orange. I'm going to take some of these nice church window feathers and pick two fairly small ones. I don't really like the cheeks to go too far back. Some people tie them like a third of the way back. I tend to go a little bit less than that. I'll pick two feathers that are as similar as possible in size. And turn them back to back. I can just keep them where they are. I want to get the length the way I want them, get the tips lined up, figure out the length I want, and then, as with anything else, strip off the excess fibers that I don't want. Shorten the shaft a little bit, then I can lay these on the side. I'm going to turn this to myself so I get a better view, laying it right on the side, binding it down, making sure I'm happy with how it looks. Then I can finish binding down on one side, roll it over to the other side, and repeat, making sure I like the length. Lay it on the side. These tend not to need the flattening as much, although sometimes a few of them will need to be flattened. And then I'm going to bind down, clean up, and if I've done it properly, I won't have anything else I need to clip off. And I've got a little fiber here that's in the way, so I can clip that. Alright, and I'll rotate it to make sure I'm happy with how it looks all the way around. I need to clean it up just a little bit more coming back. Now I'll come back. Now just whip finish. One, two, three, four, five. And I find that's plenty. Never have them pop out. Another loose fiber there. Let me get rid of that. And then it's time for head cement. And this is just the Sally Hansen hard as nails. Just rotating it to make sure I get good coverage. And that also gives, with that rusty brown, gives that appropriate coppery look. So what I end up with is something that has a look of almost being coppery. Not perfect, but it gives the desired effect, and it definitely catches landlocked salmon. I've caught brook trout on them, and I've even caught lake trout coming up for them. So there you have it, a Munsungan Gold. Hope you like it. I'd appreciate any comments or questions you have. You can leave those down below, and thank you very much.